Welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. I'm Chloe, and if you make yourselves comfortable, I have a story for you. It was the gloomiest of nights in the old days of the Somerset Levels. Clouds filled across the sky, just a glimmer of starlight. And down on the ground, someone was lost in the marshes. It was Miles, the farm boy. Coming home late from working in the fields, somehow he'd meandered off the causeway and now he couldn't find his way out of the puddles and the ponds and the squelching, sucking mud. All around him rose the stench of old churned mud. And across the marshes, all around him in the air danced the tiddy lights, the marsh lights. A dangerous blue, an acid yellow, a poison green, those little bobbing, floating, dancing lights trying to lure him into the deadly depths of the marshes. Overhead, the moon suddenly pushed aside great clumps of cloud and peered down. She saw the farm boy looking this way and that, utterly uncertain. And so she leaned down from the sky and shone her moonbeams clear down to the ground. And she showed him the way back to the causeway. He hurried, but not before looking over his shoulder, looking up at her and grinning, "Thank you." And on to the causeway he went. But as he reached it, he looked back again because he heard a scream. A screech or a scream, a woman or a vixen out in those wildlands, he couldn't be sure. And then a sense of horror rose in him as the ground he was looking at seemed to heave and a pyramid of somethings, of creatures, rose up. And as the moon leaned down, those somethings leapt and caught her by the moonbeams and dragged her down. Miles couldn't see it clearly. His eyesight was too weak. But the screeches and the squeals terrified him, and he ran. What had happened? What had happened was that the moon herself had become curious to see what was rising up out of the mud in the marshlands of the Somerset Levels. She'd heard rumours from that part of the world, from everywhere there are marshlands. She'd heard rumours about the night creatures, about the crawling horrors that would infest the night. And she had leaned down for a closer look. And those night creatures had seized hold of her moonbeams as if it were hair, and they had dragged her down. Of course, the moon is big and strong. She broke free. She ran. But on the ground, on the earth, she was uncertain. Her sparkly silver slippers fell off and she was barefoot, stubbing her toes, cutting her bare feet on sharp things, running for her life, with the squealings and the screechings and the snarlings and the hissings following her ever closer. She ran and nearly ran headlong into a huge dark pool in the centre of the marshes. She teetered on the edge. She wrenched herself away, but as she did so, the hem of her cloak flared out and caught on a big old dead tree there at the pool's edge. And the more that the moon tried to pull herself free, the more that old tree seemed to hang on to her cloak, and that old tree was not a kind thing to behold. It stood there, tall, utterly dark, with a couple of dead branches sticking out either side like the parody of a Christian cross. And over the top of the tree there hung a blue-white marsh light, so poisonous, so dangerous. And all around, the popping of mud bubbles and the stink of mud. And then the bogles and the boggarts and the creatures of the night were swarming around the moon. They had her, they'd caught her. She shrieked and she struggled as the bogles and boggarts prodded her and clutched her and pulled at her skirts. And then there were puffs of cold, foul breath in her face, and dead fingers, cold, dead fingers, swarming and crawling over her like 1,000 spiders. They had a hold of her all right, but those bogles and boggarts and dead creatures, they couldn't agree what to do. They wanted some foul thing to do to her, but would they poison her? Would they tear her apart? Would they press her down into the mud and suffocate her? They couldn't decide, and they quarrelled so long that the eastern horizon began to pale. So all at once the evil creatures shouted out, "Quick, quick, we must do something!" And they looked at the pool of dark water, and they dragged the moon from the tree, and they hurled her into the water. Down she sank, and some more of the creatures went to the old standing stone at the far side of the pool and rocked it and toppled it down on top of the moon as she sank. And she sank down into the waters, and in the waters was old rusted armour and broken swords and skeletons and skulls that grinned and leered at her as she sank down into the foul depths. So the bogles and boggarts trapped the moon down in the ooze. Her light, her silver moonlight, was gone from the world, and the light had gone from inside her as well. The moon, all her existence, had been alone. It never even occurred to her to call out for help to anyone. Miles, the farm boy, ran home as fast as he could. But his master, the farmer, and the farmer's wife, they didn't believe his story. He told them what he'd seen. He told them about the moon dragged out of the sky, and they smiled at him. Well, Miles was accounted slow. In Cornwall, they would have called him gentle. He was not a quick-witted young man. And they'd forgotten that somebody like Miles struggles to imagine anything. It is very difficult for someone like Miles to make up a story. He said, "I seen what happened to the moon. I seen her fall. I seen her caught, I reckon." And they said, "You shouldn't drink so much cider. You got merry on the perry. You shouldn't do that." And they laughed. Miles tried to insist, but they wouldn't listen. And this was unusual because most of the time the farmer and his wife were kind to Miles. They'd taken him in when nobody else would. Other people taunted Miles for his big round face and his snub nose and his weak little eyes. They called him Pig Snout, they called him Moon Face, and they called him worse than that. But the farmer and his wife had been pleased at how willing Miles was to work for them. They were pleased at his strength. And he was a sweet character when all was said and done. So they took care of him, and they kept the cruel people away from him. But they still didn't believe what he told them that night. It took about 14 nights for people all across the Somerset Levels to realize that the moon had disappeared. She wasn't just taking her few days of rest at the end of the month, she'd gone. And at night in the villages and on the farms, everyone huddled indoors because they could hear things moving outside. There were rustlings and scrapings. There were hissings and snarlings. They put salt across the threshold. They barred the doors and the windows, all those people in those houses. And they sat and huddled together with one rushlight, and they stayed absolutely silent, listening to the noises of whatever it was coming past their cottages and houses, and sniffing, and coming right up to the doorstep and thump, making the whole place shake as they tried to get in, and then hissing as the salt kept them away. In the morning, there'd be carnage in the chicken pens, sad little clusters of feathers and piles of severed feet. Milk turned sour in the cows' udders. It was a very bad time in the marshes. So no one could stay out after sunset. Of course, the pubs did well. As soon as the sun was setting, you hurried for your home, you hurried for a friend's home, you hurried for the pub. And it was one night in an inn. There was the fire, there was the hearth, there was a half circle of farmers and farm workers with their pipes and pipe smoke and pints, and not as much laughter or singing as usual. All the talk was of the moon. The farmer and Miles had been on their way home from Taunton Market, and they had had to take refuge there as well. And they'd listened to the talk, and suddenly Miles spoke up. "I seen what happened to the moon, and we got to go and help her. She shone for me. She showed me the way back to the safe path. I know what happened to her. They took her. And now we got to go and find her. We got to go and save the moon." And his big round face was so serious that everyone listened to him. And his master, the farmer, scratched his head and said, "Well, I didn't believe him before, but after all this time, and also I reckon Miles doesn't tell lies. He doesn't make up stories. But what are we going to do?" And no one had an answer to that. So the next morning, the farmer and Miles and a lot of other people went to see the wise woman of the marshes. She wasn't best pleased to see them, and they begged for her help. "What do you expect me to do?" "Well, can't you cast a spell? Can't you bring the moon back?" "If you think that saving the moon, bringing her back, is as easy as casting a spell, then you are slower and more dim-witted than young Miles here. No, it is not that simple. Now, shut up and let me smoke my pipe and think." And they all had to sit or stand and watch as the wise woman paced back and forth across the living room floor, and she smoked, and then she got a bucket of water, and she looked into the water, and she was thinking, and everyone was biting their tongues and scratching their fingernails, and then at last she said, "I cannot tell you exactly what has happened to the moon," and they all sighed, "but I can tell you what you've got to do. Tonight, all of you must go together. You must go into the marshes, and you must stay absolutely silent. You must hold your Lord's Prayer in your heads and your hearts. You must stay absolutely silent, and you must go into the heart of the marshes, and you must look for a cross, a candle, and a coffin. And more than that I can't tell you, but it'll help you find the moon." They were all a bit baffled by this, and they said, "Mistress, you're probably right, but "We dare not go in the marshes by night. It's too dangerous. There's bogles and there's boggats and there's the crawling creatures of the night. We dare not go in there." The wise woman stamped her foot and she said, "You cowards, if you don't do this, you'll never have your moon back." And then there was Miles, with his big round face, red with anger. He was crying with anger. "We've got to do this. We've got to save the moon. She saved me. Now we've got to go. If you won't go, then I'll go by myself. I knows how to stay silent, and I knows the Lord's Prayer forwards and backwards. I'll go by myself if you won't." And he was so serious and so angry and so brave that he shamed the lot of them into agreeing to go and look for the moon out in the marshes. At sunset, a line of men shambled off the causeway. Soon they were into the not quite paths in between the puddles and the ponds and the pools, and their boots crunched, and then their boots squelched through the sucking mud, and all around them the tiddy lights danced and beckoned and lured, acid yellow, dangerous blue, poison green, trying to draw them off the paths and into the deep, dangerous heart of the marshes. But no one would follow the lights. At the front of the line there was a man with a lantern, and the men followed him. Each man had his hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him. And Miles, the farm boy, was held safe in the middle of the line. He was supposed to stay at home, but he'd cried and shouted and protested so much and wept snot all down his shirt, it was easier to bring him with them. The men walked through the marshes for a long time. They walked until their minds were filling up with sleep. And then they came to that dark pool. At the edge of it they saw the old dead tree with the two branches sticking out in a parody of the Christian cross, and the blue-white tiddy light above it like a candle. So they'd found the cross, they'd found the candle, and where was the coffin? They looked around, and then they saw in the pool the old standing stone lying flat, and from under it came a shimmer, a pulsing glimmer of silver light that was fading even as they watched it. And some of the men nearly gasped aloud, but all of them had put pebbles under their tongues to keep silent. Keep silent they must, keep silent they did. All of these people worked together often. They didn't need to speak to each other. They were farmers, they were farm workers, they helped on each other's farms in all the seasons of the year, especially at harvest, especially with the heavy work. And most of them had their walking sticks, and some of them found pieces of wood, and they used all those sticks and pieces of wood to get around one side of that stone and lever it up. As it rolled, the light exploded out, and the moon swooped up free, flying up into the sky. The men flinched away from the brightness, and all across the Somerset Levels there were howls and shrieks and yowls and hisses as all the bogles and boggats and evil creatures of the night were driven back by moonlight, driven down into their holes and crevices, and they did not dare come out again. So up flew the moon into her place in the sky. And then the men could laugh out loud. They cheered, they waved up at the moon. And for the first time in her existence, she understood that she was recognized, that she was loved by all the people that she kept safe with her light. And that is remembered across the marshes to this very day. All around the world, people who live in the wetlands love the moon for the light she gives them that shows them the safe paths. And there was one thing that Miles the farm boy only ever told the wise woman, which was that as he, standing well back, watched it all happen, the end of that story, as the moon swooped past him, for a moment they looked straight at each other, and Miles saw the moon's face, so round, so much bigger than his own, and he had been mocked most of his life for his round moon face. But when he looked at the moon, he realized, and he remembered forever, that the moon face was beautiful.